The letter wasn't addressed to her. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. Her hands froze. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight as she stared at the faded envelope. The attic had been quiet for years. Nobody came up here anymore. Not since the children moved out. Not since life became smaller, quieter, more predictable. But now, standing among old boxes and forgotten memories, Margaret held something that made her heart pound like it hadn't in years. A letter. Hidden, forgotten, and addressed to someone she had never heard of. 25 years. That was how long she had been married to Thomas. 25 years of shared birthdays, shared bills, shared struggles, shared dreams. At least, that's what she thought. Because in 25 years of marriage, you start believing you know everything about the person sleeping beside you. Their fears, their favorite foods, the stories they've told 100 times, the stories they never tell, or at least, you think you know them. The discovery happened on an ordinary Saturday, the kind of day nobody remembers. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Thomas was visiting a friend across town. Margaret decided to clean the attic, not because it needed cleaning, because she needed a distraction. The house felt different lately, too quiet, too empty. Their youngest daughter had moved away 6 months earlier. The bedroom sat untouched. The dinner table felt larger. Even conversations seemed shorter. Many couples dream about having the house to themselves again. Margaret used to think she would too. But nobody talks about what happens afterward. Nobody talks about the silence. The strange realization that one day you'll look across the room and realize it's just the two of you again. No school events, no soccer practice, no late-night emergencies. Just two people trying to remember who they were before parenthood took over their lives. At first, Margaret thought the attic project would be fun. A little nostalgia, a little organizing, maybe a few laughs. Instead, it became something else entirely. She sorted through old toys, photo albums, Christmas decorations, boxes labeled in handwriting she immediately recognized as Thomas's. Then she found an old wooden chest tucked behind a stack of suitcases. She didn't remember seeing it before, which was strange, because she remembered almost everything in this house. The chest wasn't locked. Inside were papers, old receipts, birthday cards, letters, dozens of letters, most of them addressed to family members, friends, relatives. Nothing unusual, until one envelope caught her attention. It looked older than the others, more worn, more important somehow. The paper had yellowed with age. Its edges were fragile, like it had been touched many times, then hidden away. Margaret slowly turned it over, and that's when her stomach tightened. Written across the front were 4 simple words: "To my dearest Evelyn, Evelyn." Not Margaret, not anyone she knew, Evelyn. She stared at the name, once, twice, 3 times, trying to convince herself she was misunderstanding something. Maybe it belonged to a relative, maybe an old family friend, maybe someone from long before they met. But something about the envelope felt different, personal, intimate, important. And then she noticed the handwriting. It belonged to Thomas. She knew it instantly. After 25 years, there was no mistaking it. Suddenly, the attic felt warmer, smaller, harder to breathe in. Margaret carefully sat down on an old storage box. The envelope rested in her hands, unopened. Yet somehow already changing everything. Part of her wanted to put it back, close the chest, pretend she never found it. But another part of her, the part that had spent 25 years building a life with one man, needed answers. Who was Evelyn? Why had Thomas written to her? And why had he hidden the letter all these years? As rain continued falling outside,
Margaret slowly opened the envelope.
Never imagining that the words inside would force her to question everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Margaret stared at the letter for several seconds before reading the first line. Her heart was beating so loudly she could barely focus. The attic seemed unusually quiet. Even the rain outside felt distant. Finally, she began to read. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, then life probably didn't unfold the way either of us imagined." Margaret frowned. The words felt deeply personal. Not casual, not friendly, personal. She continued reading. "There are some people we carry with us forever, even when years pass and life takes us in different directions. Margaret swallowed hard. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to confusion. Who was this woman? And why did Thomas sound so emotional? She kept reading. I still remember the summer afternoons near the lake. The way you laughed at things nobody else found funny. The way you believed in me before I believed in myself. Margaret lowered the letter. Her hands were shaking slightly now. 25 years of marriage, and she had never once heard the name Evelyn. Not once. Most couples share stories from their past, old friendships, former jobs, embarrassing teenage memories. Thomas had told her plenty, but never this. Margaret stared out the small attic window. Her mind immediately started filling in blanks. Dangerous blanks. The kind people create when they don't have enough information. Had Thomas loved someone else? Before her during their marriage? Was this an old relationship? A secret? A regret? The questions came faster than the answers. She looked back down at the letter. Part of her didn't want to continue. But stopping now felt impossible. The next paragraph caught her attention immediately. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had made different choices. Margaret's stomach tightened. Different choices. Those two words echoed inside her head. She imagined Thomas writing this, alone, years ago, carefully choosing each word, then hiding it in the attic, never mentioning it. Why? The next lines made her chest ache. Life gave me more than I deserved. A family, a home, children who make me proud every day. Margaret paused. That sounded familiar. That sounded like Thomas. Then came another sentence. But some memories never leave us. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether she wanted the truth anymore, because the truth has a strange way of changing things, even when nothing actually changes. You can spend years feeling secure, comfortable, certain. Then one discovery makes you question everything. And that's exactly what was happening now. She continued reading. I don't regret the life I built, not for a second, but I regret never telling you goodbye. Margaret froze. Goodbye. The word carried a different weight, a different meaning. This didn't sound like an affair. It didn't sound like someone Thomas secretly wished he had married. It sounded unfinished, like a chapter that never properly ended. For the first time since opening the letter, Margaret felt her anger soften slightly, replaced by curiosity. Who exactly was Evelyn? And why had Thomas never spoken about her? Then she noticed something else. A date, written at the bottom of the page. 27 years ago. Margaret stared at it. 27 years. That was before she and Thomas met, before their first date, before their engagement, before everything. Suddenly, the story inside her head shifted. Maybe she wasn't looking at a betrayal. Maybe she was looking at a piece of Thomas's life that existed before she entered it, a piece he never found the courage to share. But one question still remained. If the letter was written before they met, why was it hidden? Why keep it all these years? And more importantly, why never send it? Margaret carefully folded the letter, then reached back into the wooden chest. That's when she noticed something she had completely missed. Underneath the first letter, all addressed to Evelyn. Her breath caught instantly. One letter could be explained, maybe even understood. But an entire stack? Suddenly the mystery felt much bigger than she imagined. And as thunder rumbled softly outside, Margaret picked up the second envelope, realizing she was only beginning to uncover a story that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Margaret stared at the stack of envelopes. There were 6 of them, all carefully tied together with an old blue ribbon, all addressed to the same person, Evelyn. The attic suddenly felt less like a storage room and more like a doorway into a life she had never known existed. For several moments, Margaret simply sat there, the letters resting in her lap, her thoughts racing. 25 years of marriage. And somehow, she had never heard this name. Not once. She picked up the second envelope. The paper was slightly newer than the first, still old, but clearly written sometime later, slowly. She opened it. Dear Evelyn, today I learned something difficult. You're gone. Margaret immediately stopped reading. Gone? Her eyes returned to the sentence, reading it again and again. You're gone. A strange feeling washed over her, because suddenly, the story was changing. Again. This wasn't a secret romance. At least, it didn't seem like one. She continued reading carefully. I spent years thinking I would eventually see you again. Maybe at a grocery store, maybe walking through town, maybe by complete accident. Life has a funny way of reconnecting people. Or so I hoped. Margaret felt her chest tighten. The words weren't romantic. Not exactly. They felt sad, like someone grieving a piece of their past. The letter continued. When I heard the news, I sat in my car for nearly an hour. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. Because nobody in my life knew what you meant to me. Margaret lowered the paper slowly. Nobody in my life knew what you meant to me. That sentence lingered for the first time. She felt something unexpected. Not jealousy, not fear. Compassion. Because everyone has chapters of their life they struggle to explain. Some stories become too complicated, too painful, too distant, and eventually, people stop talking about them altogether. She looked toward the rain-covered window, thinking, maybe Thomas hadn't hidden these letters because he was hiding a person. Maybe he was hiding a wound he never fully healed. The thought surprised her. Because after 25 years together, Margaret had started believing she knew every important part of her husband. Now she wasn't so sure. She opened the third letter. This one was shorter. Only a few paragraphs. But halfway through, her eyes landed on a sentence that changed everything. You were the closest thing I ever had to a sister. Margaret froze. A sister? She immediately reread the line. Then everything began shifting into place. The confusion, the emotion, the grief. Not a former lover, not an old girlfriend. A sister she had never known existed. Margaret's heart pounded. How was that possible? Thomas had always described himself as an only child. Always. Family gatherings, conversations, holiday dinners. Never once had he mentioned a sister. Not even in passing. The realization left Margaret speechless. She quickly continued reading. I still remember the day they took you away. We were too young to understand. Too young to stop it. Too young to know we'd never see each other again. Margaret felt chills. Suddenly, she understood why the letters felt unfinished, why they felt full of unanswered questions. Because Thomas never got closure. He never got the chance to say goodbye, never got the chance to explain what happened. And apparently, neither did anyone else. Margaret leaned back against an old box, trying to process what she had just learned. For decades, her husband had carried a secret heartbreak. Not because he didn't trust her, but perhaps because the pain had become part of him. So deeply buried that speaking about it felt impossible. Then, she noticed something tucked inside the envelope, a photograph, carefully folded. Protected all these years, Margaret slowly pulled it out. The picture was faded, old, taken sometime in the late 1970s. Two children stood beside a small lake, a boy around 10 years old, a girl around 8. Both smiling at the camera. Margaret immediately recognized the boy. Thomas, young, happy, carefree, standing beside a girl she had never seen before. Evelyn, and suddenly, for the first time all afternoon, Margaret realized these letters weren't revealing a hidden relationship. They were revealing a hidden tragedy, one that had quietly shaped the man she married, without her ever knowing. But the biggest question still remained. Why had Thomas spent his entire adult life pretending Evelyn never existed? And what exactly happened between them all those years ago, as thunder echoed softly outside? Margaret reached for the fourth letter. Knowing the answers were finally getting closer, Margaret carefully unfolded the fourth letter. By now, the rain outside had become heavier. Thunder rolled softly in the distance, but she barely noticed. Every part of her attention was fixed on the pages in her hands. The letter began differently than the others, shorter, more emotional, almost as if Thomas had struggled to write it. Dear Evelyn, today would have been your 43rd birthday. Margaret's heart sank. She looked at the old photograph again, the smiling little girl by the lake. The sister Thomas never spoke about, the sister she never knew existed. Slowly, she continued reading. I still wonder who you would have become, what your laugh would sound like now, whether you would have had children. Margaret blinked away tears. This wasn't a love story, not the kind she feared. It was something much sadder. A lifetime of wondering. A lifetime of missing someone who never got the chance to grow up beside you, stab you. The next paragraph explained more. Sometimes I think about calling you. Then I remember there's no number to call, no address, no place to visit, only memories. Margaret lowered the page. Her chest felt heavy, because she could suddenly imagine Thomas carrying this burden for decades, smiling through birthdays, working long hours, raising children, building a life, all while quietly carrying a loss nobody knew about. The letter continued. Mom never talked about what happened. Dad refused to mention your name. And eventually, everyone acted like you never existed. Margaret sat upright. Her eyes widened. That sentence explained something, maybe even everything. If Thomas grew up in a family that buried painful memories, perhaps he learned to do the same. Perhaps silence became survival. The way some families avoid difficult conversations. Not because they don't care, but because the pain feels too large to touch. She continued reading. For years, I convinced myself I was okay, but every birthday reminds me that I lost more than a sister. I lost a part of my story. Margaret felt tears forming. A part of my story. The words stayed with her. Because they felt true. How many people spend their lives carrying unfinished chapters? Pretending they're fine. Pretending they've moved on, while secretly wondering how life might have looked if things had been different. The next page revealed the truth. The truth Thomas had apparently never spoken aloud. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read. The day they took you away, I promised I'd find you one day. She frowned. Taken away? What did that mean? The answer came a few lines later, and when it did, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The different foster homes, they told us it would only be temporary. They were wrong. Margaret stared at the page. Frozen. Suddenly, everything made sense. Thomas wasn't an only child. He had a sister, a little sister, and during childhood, they had been separated, not by choice, not by distance, by circumstance. The realization hit Margaret hard, because she understood something now. Thomas hadn't lost Evelyn through death alone. He lost her twice. First when they were separated, and again when he learned she was gone. The letter continued. I searched for years. Every time I moved to a new city. Every time I changed jobs. Every time I met someone who might know something. I searched. Margaret covered her mouth. While building a life together, Thomas had quietly searched for the sister he lost as a child. And never found her, not until it was too late. Then came the final paragraph. The paragraph that broke her heart completely. I'm writing this because I don't know where else to put my grief. Nobody remembers you anymore, but I do. And I always will. Margaret closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She believed she knew her husband completely, but sitting in that attic, she realized something important. You can deeply love someone, spend decades beside them, build an entire life together, and still discover parts of their heart they've never found the courage to share. As she folded the letter carefully, her eyes landed on the final envelope, the oldest one. Unlike the others, this envelope had never been opened. Across the front, Thomas had written only 3 words. For when found, Margaret's heartbeat quickened. Because suddenly she wasn't sure the letter was meant for Evelyn. It felt like it was meant for someone else. Someone who might one day discover the truth. With trembling hands, Margaret reached for the final envelope. Margaret stared at the final envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Evelyn. It wasn't addressed to anyone at all. The paper looked older, more worn, as if it had been opened and closed many times over the years. Yet somehow, it remained sealed. Across the front, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were 3 simple words. For when found, heartbeat quickened. The attics suddenly felt very still. The rain continued tapping softly against the roof, but everything else seemed silent. She turned the envelope over carefully. Nothing, no name, no explanation. Just those 3 words.
For when found.
As if Thomas always knew someone would eventually discover the letters. As if he had been waiting for this moment, Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, and a photograph. She looked at the photograph first. It showed Thomas, older now. probably in his late 20s, standing beside a small gravestone. His expression was difficult to describe. Not sadness, not exactly. More like relief. The kind of relief people feel after searching for something for a very long time. Margaret frowned, then unfolded the letter. The first line immediately caught her attention. "If you're reading this, then you've found Evelyn's letters." Margaret's breath caught. The letter was meant for her. Or whoever discovered the truth. She continued reading. "For most of my life, I didn't talk about Evelyn. Not because I forgot her. Not because she wasn't important, but because remembering hurt too much." Margaret felt tears forming again. She suddenly understood something. The silence wasn't secrecy. It was grief. The kind of grief people learn to hide because carrying it openly feels impossible. The letter continued. "When we were children, Evelyn and I promised we'd always stay together. We were too young to understand that some promises aren't ours to keep." Margaret swallowed hard. Mitto. The little boy and little girl from the photograph. Standing beside that lake, believing the world would never separate them. Never imagining how quickly life could change. The next paragraph explained everything. "I spent almost 20 years searching for her. Every lead ended in disappointment. Every rumor led nowhere. Every hopeful phone call ended the same way." Margaret looked toward the attic window. 20 years. 20 years of searching, and she never knew. Not because Thomas lied, because he never spoke about it. The difference suddenly felt important. Then she reached the sentence that changed everything. "3 months before I met you, Margaret." Margaret froze. "What?" Her eyes rushed back to the sentence. She read it again. "3 months before I met you, I finally found her." Tears filled her eyes. Thomas found Evelyn. After all those years, he actually found her. Her hands trembled as she continued reading. "By the time I found her, she had already been gone for 6 months." Margaret closed her eyes. The pain in those words felt almost unbearable. So close after decades of searching, after years of hope, after never giving up. "Too late," the letter continued. "I stood at her grave for nearly 4 hours. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to say goodbye to someone I never got the chance to know again." Margaret wiped tears from her face. Now she understood the photograph. The relief, the sadness, the closure all mixed together, because sometimes finding the answer doesn't erase the pain. It simply gives the pain a place to rest. Then came the part that Margaret would never forget. "The day I visited her grave." She leaned forward. "I promised that if life ever gave me a second chance at family, I would never take it for granted." Margaret's eyes filled completely, because suddenly, everything connected: the devoted husband, the loving father, the man who never missed a school play, the man who stayed up all night when the children were sick, the man who called just to make sure everyone got home safely. All of it, not because he was perfect, because he knew what it felt like to lose family, and he never wanted to lose it again. The final section of the letter was addressed directly to her. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then I want you to know something." Tears rolled up her cheeks. "You were never my second choice. You were never a replacement for anyone. You were the answer to a prayer I stopped believing would be answered." Margaret covered her mouth. "Evelyn was part of my past, but you became my future. You gave me the family I thought I'd lost forever." The attic blurred through her tears, because after hours of questions, fear, and uncertainty, the truth was far more beautiful than she ever expected. Then she read the final lines. "If there is one lesson hidden in these letters, it's this: tell the people you love their importance while they're still here. Don't wait. Don't assume they already know. Life is shorter than we think." Margaret folded the letter slowly. She sat there in silence. Not grieving, not worrying, just understanding. Understanding her husband a little more than she had the day before, and realizing that even after 25 years of marriage, there were still new things to learn about the person she loved. Then, she heard the front door downstairs open. Thomas was home, and for the first time in hours, Margaret smiled, because she knew exactly what she was going to do next. For several minutes, Margaret remained in the attic. The letters rested quietly beside her. The rain had begun to slow, and for the first time that afternoon, her mind felt calm. Not because she had found all the answers, but because she finally understood the questions. Thomas hadn't hidden a secret life. He hadn't hidden another love. He had hidden a heartbreak, a loss, a chapter of his life he never learned how to talk about. Margaret carefully placed every letter back into the wooden chest, one by one, almost respectfully, as if she were putting memories back where they belonged. Then she picked up the photograph, the one of young Thomas and Evelyn standing beside the lake. She smiled softly. "You would have loved him," she whispered, and somehow she believed Evelyn would have. Downstairs, she heard the front door close, then footsteps, then Thomas's voice. "Margaret?" A simple word, a familiar voice, the same voice she'd heard almost every day for 25 years. But today, it sounded different. Not because Thomas had changed, because she had learned something new about the man behind the voice. She slowly walked downstairs, the photograph tucked gently beneath her arm. Thomas was standing in the kitchen, holding grocery bags, looking slightly confused. "There you are," he said. "I've been calling for you." Then he noticed her face, the tears, the emotion. Instantly, his expression changed. Margaret, concern replaced confusion. "What's wrong?" For a moment, she simply looked at him. The man she'd built a life with. The man who still made coffee every morning. The man who checked the locks before bed. The man who never forgot birthdays. The man who once spent 20 years searching for his little sister and never told anyone. Finally, she placed the photograph on the kitchen table. Thomas looked down. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. He recognized the photograph immediately. "Evelyn," he whispered. Margaret nodded. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not angry, just honest. The kind of silence that comes before a truth finally gets spoken. Thomas slowly sat down, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "I always wondered if someone would find those letters someday." Margaret sat beside him. "Why didn't you tell me?" The questions wasn't harsh. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply real. Thomas stared at the table for a long time, then finally answered. "Because I didn't know how." His voice was quiet. "When I was younger, I told myself I'd talk about it eventually." He smiled sadly. Then years passed. A few years became 10. 10 became 20. And the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became. Margaret. Thomas continued. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I thought I was protecting myself." He laughed softly. "But maybe I was protecting the pain." Margaret reached for his hand. For the first time all afternoon, Thomas allowed himself to talk. Really talk about Evelyn, about the foster homes, about the years of searching, about the day he found her grave, about the guilt, the hope, the heartbreak, stories he had carried alone for decades, stories that finally had somewhere to go. The conversation lasted hours. Long after dinner, long after sunset, long after the rain stopped, and when it finally ended, something had changed. Not dramatically, not magically, but meaningfully. Because sometimes intimacy isn't built by learning something new about someone. Sometimes it's built by finally understanding something they've carried for years. Later that night, Margaret found herself standing beside the bedroom window, watching the stars. Thomas joined her quietly. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Margaret smiled. "You know what? I thought I knew everything about you." Thomas laughed softly. Both smiled. Then Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable, peaceful, home, and in that moment, she realized something beautiful. The strongest marriages aren't the ones without secrets. They're the ones where love remains strong enough to survive the truth, because no matter how long you've known someone, there will always be parts of their story still waiting to be understood. Moral of the story: everyone carries chapters they rarely talk about. Hidden grief, old wounds, forgotten dreams, silent heartbreaks. Before assuming you know someone's entire story, remember this: even the people closest to us may be carrying pain we've never seen. Ask questions, listen carefully, love deeply, and never wait too long to tell people they matter. because understanding someone completely isn't what makes relationships strong. Continuing to learn them is. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. What is something about a loved one that you learned years later and never forgot? And if you enjoy emotional stories about love, family, forgiveness, and life's hidden lessons, subscribe to The Untold Cost, because sometimes the stories we never tell cost us the most.